Good evening or good day, people. I thought, as we've just gone past Armistice Day, when the First World War ended, it would be worth doing a probably fairly short stream about the British Army in World War One. The first thing I want to say is that, as far as I'm concerned, World War One was the stupidest war Britain has ever got involved in. And in particular, raising a mass land army was absolutely crazy and against all British historical precedent. Britain didn't do that. Britain relied on the Royal Navy. We are, after all, an island nation. But in World War One, we decided to raise a mass land army, as well as having the largest navy the world has ever seen. And it was a mistake. It was a huge mistake, and Britain has gone downhill ever since. And without World War One, there would not have been a World War Two, which is one of the things I think that British nationalism absolutely must step over. World War Two was like, I don't know what it was. It certainly didn't do Britain much good, to be honest. On the other hand, of course, the guys who fought in World War II were fighting for Britain and their families. They weren't fighting for any nonsense about globalism or all this other crap that we see Natsocks talking about. But let's go back to World War One. World War One, the British Army was this beautiful thing apart from all the other armies in Europe. The British Army was a long-service professional army. And all the other armies in Europe were conscripts. They were guys who'd done a year or two in their military and then gone back to civilian life and then got called up again. Now, the British Army also had those reserves, but far fewer, because obviously it was a professional army. And the British Army in 1914 was the best trained. They were probably the best soldiers ever to walk the earth, if you asked me, honestly. Most of the senior and middle ranking officers and many of the senior NCOs and a hell of a lot of the reservists who were called up in 1914 in UK had seen action in places like the Sudan in 1898, in the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, and particularly in the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902. So these guys, they'd been and they'd seen and they knew what was going on. They weren't like new recruits who'd never been under fire or anything like that. And they were so well trained that with their excellent short magazine Lee Enfield rifles, actually everyone in the British Army who was in a frontline role could do at least 15 aimed rounds a minute, and in many cases 30 aimed rounds a minute and more. And in the early clashes between the British Army and the Germans, for example, Mons and Le Cateau, many German officers thought the British Army had loads and loads of machine guns. Simply wasn't true. They didn't. A British infantry battalion had 2 Vickers Maxim machine guns, as did a British cavalry regiment. They had 2. The reason the Germans thought they had so many was because the British rifle fire was so rapid and so accurate. And like German half-company columns were just destroyed all the time. The British Army was just this beautiful thing apart, but it was small. And what happened to it was that over 1914 and the early part of 1915, it was destroyed by the German artillery. The Germans had far more guns than the British. They had more guns and they had heavier guns than the British did. And while the German infantry, even when they outnumbered the Brits by 2 to 1, couldn't advance. Their artillery, which could sometimes outnumber the Brits 4 or 5 to 1, could absolutely do that. And that's what happened. The British soldiers weren't killed by the German infantry; they were killed by the German artillery. It was kind of like a mincing machine. When the British Army marched into battle, singing "We don't give a fuck" for old von Kluck and all the German army, they were absolutely correct. Battalion for battalion, the British Army could defeat any army on earth. They were that well trained and that good as soldiers and that brave, it has to be said. But they were destroyed in the mincing machine of the German artillery. And as a result, a lot of the territorial army, which was the British civilians who volunteered to go and do weekends and the odd couple of weeks camp and stuff, those guys were brought into the front line. And Britain went around the empire and got together the guys who were overseas garrisons. I think it was, I'm trying to remember, it was 28th or 29th Division. I think it was the 29th Division that landed at Gallipoli and won 6 VCs before breakfast. They won 6 Victoria Crosses before breakfast, landing at Lancashire Landing, because the Lancashire Fusiliers were one of the main regiments who attacked there. Very fine regiment. And so then what happened after that was the British Army then, because we decided to raise this mass army, which was something Britain had never done in the past, and in my view was an utter mistake, because we had the greatest navy in the world. Like, okay, you have a couple of British divisions or even 3 or 4 fighting on the flank of the French, great, but you don't try and take over half the French front, which is actually what Britain did in World War I. And if you fight the main body of the main enemy on land, you're going to have enormous casualties, and that's what happened to Britain in World War I. And after the regular army was basically expended, and the territorial army was also to a large degree expended, Britain had to fall back onto the volunteers who had joined Kitchener's New Armies. Everyone's seen the poster, you know, your country and empire needs you and all this kind of shit. And also it's worth pointing out that the early feminists, like the suffragettes, decided to get rid of their campaign for women voting in World War I and instead spend their time going around giving white feathers to any British guy of vaguely military age who was not in uniform. I knew a bloke, like I'm an old bugger. I'm like 55 years old, and I knew a bloke in the late 1970s who was a First World War soldier, and he was wounded on the Somme. Was sent back to UK, like for medical treatment and all this, and was on leave prior to going back to his regiment. And some nasty middle-class suffragette feminist bitch came up to him and gave him a white feather. And he told me that he spat in her face, and I hope he really did. They were vile, like feminists always are. But anyway, so Britain had to fall back on the Kitchener volunteers, who were civilians who flocked to join the colours. There were PALS battalions, for example. You know, you'd have groups of blokes from various towns or various areas in big cities who would join together and form a regiment. And often they would elect their NCOs and even sometimes their officers. It was all very democratic and what have you. And so these guys were the blokes who fought at the Battle of the Somme. Now, the Somme was an utter disaster for the British Army. It was the worst defeat the British Army's ever had in a single-day battle. 50,000 men became casualties. If that happened today, that would be the vast majority of the British Army destroyed in one day. 20,000 blokes died. And as I say, 50,000 plus were wounded. utter disaster. And to this extent, the lions led by donkeys stuff that you hear is true. In the ordinary British soldiers were absolutely the bravest of the brave. They were real lions. But their commanders were by no means all donkeys. That's just not true. But what happened on the Somme was you had the new British Army, the Kitchener Volunteers, mostly, who were not especially well trained. They'd only joined the army maybe a year or so before, and it really takes 9 to 12 months to properly train an infantry soldier. And many of the guys on the Somme were not fully trained, particularly because the British Army also suffered from a huge lack of experienced NCOs and experienced officers. And the ones they had were mostly fighting desperately on the Western Front to hold the line. So the guys who could be spared to train the new troops in England were, with exceptions, of course, with exceptions, they were not the best or the most up-to-date. With exceptions, there were many excellent officers and excellent NCOs who trained Kitchener battalions, but most of them weren't, frankly. They were the guys they could get. Some of them had retired from the army in 1890 or something like that. So they were 20 odd years out of date. That's the truth. And the disaster on the Somme was partly because the British Army didn't trust these civilian soldiers fully. They didn't think they could do the fire and maneuver stuff that the guys in 1914 could certainly do because they were trained to do it. So they got this nonsense about, advancing at a walking pace in long lines and all this kind of stuff. It was what they thought those troops could do. I think they underestimated those soldiers by a long degree. But it was nonetheless what they did, and it hugely contributed to the losses and mistakes on the Somme. Now, in 1917, the British Army then got involved in the campaign that is called Feu de Ypres, often called Passchendaele. One of my great-grandfathers lost his leg there. He had a tin leg that my dad used to put marbles in between the wars. And because he was a nice guy, he used to laugh at my dad and call him a good little chap, even though my dad was being a little bit of a bastard, to be honest. But he was just a nice old, brave old Englishman, basically. But anyway, the British Army then got involved in this campaign. It's called Passchendaele, which got bogged down in the mud because there was huge amounts of rain and the vast amounts of artillery broke down all the drainage systems, and it was kind of like a disaster. But it was equally a disaster for the Germans, and it's also worth pointing out that on the Somme, for example, the Germans lost almost as many troops as the Brits did. Disaster for both sides, really. And Passchendaele, Feu de Ypres was kind of like that too. It was not very good. Now, gradually, from 1916 onwards, the British Army began adapting its tactics for a number of reasons. First of all, the British artillery not only became much more numerous than it was at the beginning of the war, it became much more capable. Like artillery officers, artillery is a very technical arm. If you're going to do bombardments behind enemy lines, if you're going to do creeping barrages in front of your infantry, this is all technical shit that artillery officers need to learn. You need a lot of maths and all sorts of stuff like that. And gradually Britain became better at doing that. The Royal Artillery really hugely expanded in numbers, but it got much better at the technical side of stuff. In 1916 on the Somme, it wasn't that good, in all honesty. And I'm not even talking about all the dud shells which were caused by semi-skilled labor making the shells and not doing it properly. It's not even that. It's just that the Royal Artillery got better at what they needed to do, which is a very technical part of war. Britain also invented the tank, which first saw action in 1916, but in pretty small numbers. But by 1918 was a regular part of almost every British and Commonwealth attack. An important part of the British Army in 1917 and 1918 were the old Commonwealth forces from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These guys were regarded as some of the best forces that the British Army had, rightly, because their guys were really very good. There's a lot in Australia and in Britain you'll see about Gallipoli, for example, which was a fuck up. But far more British soldiers were killed in Gallipoli than Australians. But you won't get that if you look at the popular history and popular culture of that time. But where the Australians made their biggest contribution was actually on the Western Front, as did the Canadians, as did the New Zealanders. And also some South Africans as well. There was a very good South African brigade that fought at Belle Wood, for example. But anyway, the artillery got more and more competent. The tactics of the British Army totally changed between 1914 and 1918, and anyone who says they didn't has not bothered studying the military history of World War I. And I don't mean to be rude to anyone, but honestly, if you claim to be an historian and you don't realize that the British Army tactics totally changed from 1940 to 1918, then you just haven't bothered reading even a few fairly basic books. By 1918, a British attack would be preceded by a hurricane barrage, which is a barrage that didn't last that long but was really heavy, and then would have a creeping barrage in front of it, which meant artillery shells would land in front of the advancing infantry, and they would, every couple of minutes, they would advance another 20 or 50 yards or whatever, yeah? So that, and the infantry would try and stay as close to that barrage as they possibly could, because it was better to lose a few guys from things like base caps from the shells flying backwards, and they would lose a few guys from stuff like that. But that was far better than being mowed down by the German machine guns or the German artillery. So they would try and stay really close behind that barrage. And also by 1918, most British infantry attacks would also be preceded by tanks, which again were a British military invention. And often there would be close air support. You'd have things like Sopwith Camels and Sopwith Snipes, which were biplane fighter bombers in those days, and SE-5As that would actually attack German trenches. They would strafe them with machine guns or even drop small bombs on them, again, to try and suppress the German defenses. And by 1918, there was a thing called the 100 Days. And in that 100 days, the Allied armies, that's to say the British, the French, and the Americans, made huge, enormous advances. And most of those advances were made by the British and Commonwealth forces. One day in particular, when the Canadians and Australians attacked, was called by the German Field Marshal Ludendorff the Black Day of the German army, when huge numbers of prisoners were taken, huge numbers of German machine guns and guns were captured, and loads of German soldiers ran away. And the German high command started to think, well, we can't trust our soldiers anymore because they're starting to run away, they're starting to surrender. And you will often hear people, not least the infamous Austrian painter, talking about the stab in the back of Germany in 1918. It's bullshit. The German army was defeated in action in 1918 on the Western Front. in the same way that the German fleet, which had lost at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, refused to go to sea in 1918 because they knew damn well they were all going to get sunk and killed. Like the Royal Navy was just sitting there waiting, please come out. They outnumbered them even more vastly in 1918 than they did in 1916 at Jutland. And they just wanted the German fleet to come out. But the German sailors refused to do so because they knew they were going to die. So the German fleet surrendered to the Royal Navy. And the same thing happened on the Western Front. The British Army, with its allies particularly from Australia and Canada and New Zealand, but also the Americans and the French, got the better of the German army. And they won. And they did so because their tactics had adapted hugely from 1914, and even more hugely from 1916, when actually, as I said earlier, I think the British Army underestimated the caliber of the excellent soldiers it had in Kitchener's armies in 1916 and thought they couldn't do complicated fire and movement stuff. But by 1918, they had certainly worked out that they could. And I think if you turn around and go with this whole lions led by donkeys stuff, which was a big deal in popular culture, but it hasn't been in history and in military history for many, many years. And if you say that stuff, you're doing a disservice to very many very brave and very skilled men who by 1918 could beat the German army in any sort of warfare. They could just win because they were better at what they were doing. And as I said, that includes the Royal Artillery, it includes the Royal Tank Corps, it includes the British Infantry, and it also, to some degree, also includes the RAF doing their close air support stuff and their reconnaissance and all the rest of it. And that was really all I wanted to do a short video on. I just think we underestimate those guys. But let me go back to my original point. World War One, to me, was the stupidest and dumbest war that Britain ever got involved in. Because without a World War One, there wouldn't have been a World War Two. Without any doubt, there just wouldn't have been. It was a continuation, if you like. And in particular, if Britain were going to join World War One, we were stupid for raising a mass army that could, basically run not quite half, but not much under half of the Western Front. And that's why we took such huge losses. Because if you're going to fight the main body of the main enemy, you're going to take huge losses. In World War II, those losses were mostly taken by the Soviets. In World War I, it was the British and French that took them. And it wasn't incompetence by British generals and commanders. It was, look at the losses in World War II on the Eastern Front. They were huge. Just look at the losses in Normandy, in the British Liberation Army in Normandy in 1944, in June, July, and August. The British losses, if you look at individual battalions and individual tank regiments, the British losses in Normandy in June, July, and August were at least as high, and in some cases higher, than individual units on the Somme. Just because fewer troops were involved for a much smaller length of time, people think, World War II, it was great. Everyone, the generals were better or some sort of magic stuff. Not true. The individual losses for individual infantry battalions and individual tank regiments in June, July, and August in 1944 in Normandy were sometimes heavier than individual battalions on the Somme in 1916. If you fight the main body of the enemy, you are going to have very heavy losses. It's just the way it is in modern war. You can't change it, mate. And another thing I would point out is more British generals were killed in World War One than were killed in World War Two. And you'll often get, as I say, the old lions led by donkeys canard, and it's a canard on the British leadership. It's nonsense, because more British generals were killed fighting in World War One than were killed fighting in World War Two. They were at the front leading their men. The thing about the British Army always, actually, even when I was in the British Army in the 1980s, and I'm sure still today, was officers say, follow me. They don't say, go over there. They say, follow me. And okay, mostly that's more junior officers, like it's second lieutenants and lieutenants. It's captains and sometimes majors. But in World War One, plenty of British generals were actually in the front line and getting killed too. And I just thought that was worth pointing out, because we've just gone past Armistice Day. And like I said, I really believe that if you pretend that the British Army was totally incompetent in World War One, which was not true, they weren't. They got better and better as time went on, as you would expect if you're a logical human being. You're doing a disservice to all those brave men who died. And that was really all I had to say about it. So anyway, good evening, guys, and go on. Oh, unless anyone has any questions. If anyone's got any questions in the chat, ask away and I'll try and answer them if I can. Nope. Okay then. Well, thanks very much for listening and have a good day, guys.